Nobody talked about the cold. That's the thing that gets you when you watch any video about sleeping outside, read any article about what homelessness in America looks like. They talk about the food banks and the shelters and the systems. Nobody tells you what 3 a.m. feels like when the temperature drops below freezing and you're inside a tent that was designed for a weekend camping trip in July. Declan Moor spent 2 winters in Albuquerque, New Mexico, without anyone telling him that either. He figured it out himself, not through some research project, not through a program, through watching a farmer dump something off a flatbed truck 3 blocks from where he slept, and spending about 4 days turning it into something that kept him warm when nothing else did. $30, 1 pile of straw bales, a structure that held 58 degrees on a night that hit 19. This is how he did it. Declan grew up in Bale, which is a small city about 35 miles south of Albuquerque that most people in New Mexico haven't thought about in years. His mom worked dispatch at a trucking company. His dad left when Declan was 11, which Declan will tell you mattered a lot at the time, and matters less now. He was the kind of kid who was always building things, not in a school project way, in a taking apart the lawnmower to see if he could put it back together way. He usually could. He dropped out his junior year of high school, not because he was failing, but because the money situation at home got bad enough that staying felt irresponsible. He found work at a drywall company, did that for about 2 years, learned enough to be useful, then the company went under and took 3 weeks of his pay with it. He bounced around after that. Construction work when he could get it, a few months at a distribution warehouse, a stint helping a landscaping crew that paid cash. He ended up in Albuquerque in the fall of his 20th year because that's where the next job was supposed to be. It wasn't. The guy who promised it stopped answering his phone. Declan had about $200 when he got there, which sounds like something you could work from, except that when you don't have an address, you can't get a phone plan or a bank account or a job that requires direct deposit. And when you can't get any of that, the $200 goes faster than you think. He was in the tent by November, the tent that a guy named Ruben gave him because Ruben was going to a shelter and couldn't take it. A 2-person dome tent, green with a broken zipper on the rainfly. The first night he slept in it was 28 degrees. Here's what nobody explains about cold when you're sleeping outside. It's not the air temperature. Well, it is, but that's not the part that gets you. The part that gets you is the ground. The ground pulls heat out of your body faster than the air does, and if you're sleeping on a thin foam pad on dirt, you lose more heat through your back than through any other surface. Declan learned this by feel, not by reading it anywhere. He just noticed that when he'd wake up shivering, his back was always the coldest part. He started sleeping with his jacket under him instead of on him. Warmer. Not warm enough, but warmer. He also learned that a tent holds almost no heat on its own. The material isn't insulation, it's a windbreak. If you're thinking of your tent as shelter from cold, the way a house is shelter from cold, you're going to be cold. A tent is more like a bag that stops the wind while the cold of everything around it gets in anyway. Declan spent that first winter trying to solve it with layers. More blankets, more clothes, sleeping inside his sleeping bag, inside his jacket, inside his blankets. It helped. He survived the winter. But he was cold constantly, in the way that doesn't go away when you wake up and starts before you've fallen asleep. That specific ongoing misery of never feeling warm. He was 20 years old. He'd been sleeping outside for about 3 months. The second fall, he started paying attention to how the older guys in the encampment handled it. Not just what they said, what they actually did. There was a man named Arlo who'd been out there for maybe 6 years. Arlo had built a sort of structure against a concrete wall near the railroad tracks. Not a tent, more of a 3-sided shelter with scavenged plywood and what looked like insulation foam he'd pulled from a construction dumpster. Inside that thing, even without heat, it was noticeably warmer than a tent. Declan could feel it just standing near the opening. He asked Arlo about it. Arlo said, "Air doesn't move inside. That's all it is." That answer sat with Declan for a few days. He kept thinking about what it meant. Air doesn't move inside. Dead air. Trapped air that your body's already warmed and that can't escape because there's nowhere for it to go. That's what insulation actually does, he realized. It doesn't generate heat. It slows down where the heat goes. He knew this abstractly from drywall work, but he'd never applied it to a tent. He hadn't thought of his tent as something that could be modified. He thought of it as something he lived inside. That distinction between a tent as a fixed object and a tent as a surface you could insulate is what changed everything that second fall. He was near the railroad tracks one Tuesday morning in October when a flatbed pulled up to a property about 3 blocks away. A farm supply delivery, dropping off a pallet. The driver left 2 bales on the side of the road after failing to get the pallet through a gate. Just left them sitting on the asphalt, which Declan thought was strange. He watched the truck leave. Nobody came out to get the bales. He walked over and touched one. Straw bale. Not hay. He knew the difference from the landscaping work. Straw is the dry stem after the grain comes off. No food value, used for ground cover and bedding. These were standard rectangular bales, about 18 inches wide and maybe 3 feet long, bound with orange twine. Each one weighed around 40 pounds. They were dry. He stood there for a while. What he was thinking about was insulation. What he was thinking about was dead air. Straw is hollow. Each individual straw is a hollow tube, and a bale of straw is thousands of those tubes packed together, creating millions of tiny pockets of trapped air. He knew this from somewhere, some fragment of knowledge from somewhere, in his work history. Maybe a conversation with someone on a site who mentioned straw bale construction. Whatever the source, the information was there. He took both bales. Getting them back to camp took 3 trips and most of his morning. But he got them there. The next day he walked to a farm supply store about 2 miles from camp. He had $47 saved from collecting cans. He bought 4 more bales at roughly $7 each, which is the going rate for basic straw bales in that part of New Mexico. That left him $19. 6 bales total. 2 free, 4 purchased. He spent the rest of that afternoon just looking at his tent and the bales and thinking, not planning in any formal way, just turning the problem over. He knew the goal: slow down how fast heat left the space he slept in. He knew the material: a dense, dry, lightweight insulator that cost almost nothing. The question was how to connect those 2 things in a way that didn't fall apart the first time the wind picked up. The thing about straw bales is that they're structural if you use them right. They stack. They're rectangular, so they sit flat, and a stacked row of them doesn't fall easily because of the weight and the way the twine binds them. People build actual walls out of straw bales, with a coat of plaster over them. Declan wasn't doing that. But the structural quality mattered because it meant the bales could hold their position around the tent without being fastened to anything. He arranged 4 of the bales around 3 sides of his tent, the back wall and 2 sides, stacking them in pairs so the insulation layer was about 18 inches, thick on those 3 sides. The front stayed open because he needed to get in and out. He positioned each bale so the flat face sat flush against the tent fabric. Then he broke apart the 2 free bales and scattered the loose straw under the tent's floor, raking it into about a 4-inch layer, then laying his sleeping pad. On top of it, a layer of loose straw under you is something closer to the dead air principle than a thin foam pad. The straw underneath compresses, but doesn't disappear, and it creates separation between you and the cold ground. He also packed loose straw around the base of the tent on the outside, all the way around, like a skirt at ground level. The gap between the tent floor and the ground was where a lot of the cold drafts came from. The loose straw blocked most of them. Total time, 1 full afternoon and about 2 hours the next morning. That night, it dropped to 24 degrees. He woke up at around 2 a.m., which was his usual time, the time when the cold normally made sleeping impossible. He lay there for a moment trying to figure out what was different. He wasn't shivering. His back was warm. The ground under him was warm. or at least warm relative to every other night he'd slept there. The inside of the tent was noticeably warmer than the air outside. He didn't have a thermometer. He couldn't tell you the exact temperature differential. But he knew it the way you know when something that was wrong is less wrong. That specific feeling. He went back to sleep. Slept until almost 7, which was the latest he'd slept in months. When he got up, there was frost on the outside of the straw bales. Not on the tent. The straw had absorbed the temperature change that would have gone straight to the tent fabric. You can check this yourself if you ever have the chance. Put your hand on a straw bale that's been sitting outside in freezing temperatures. The outside is cold. Push your hand into the interior and it's measurably warmer. That warmth in the middle doesn't transfer out quickly because the straw itself slows it down. He lay in his sleeping bag that morning and thought about what he'd done. Not with any sense of triumph, more like a quiet accounting of something that had worked when a lot of things hadn't. He told Arlo about it that afternoon. Arlo walked over and looked at the setup. He stood there for about a minute, not saying anything. Then he said, "You know what that is? That's the same thing those old adobe houses do. Same principle." Arlo was from Española originally, grew up around old adobe construction. He explained that traditional adobe, mud brick, works by what's called thermal mass. A thick wall absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly through the night. Straw bale works differently. It's insulation rather than thermal mass. But they're solving the same problem. How do you slow down the movement of heat out of a space? Declan had independently landed on a technique that has roots in construction methods going back centuries. He didn't know that when he built it. He figured it out from one conversation about dead air and some straw he found on the street. He was 21 years old, sleeping outside, and he worked out an insulation principle that builders use deliberately, not because he studied it, because he paid attention to a problem that nobody else was helping him solve. That's not nothing. The weeks after the first night, he kept adjusting. The front of the structure was still open, which meant cold air could move in through the tent opening. He'd been leaving the tent door partially unzipped for airflow, which sounds counterintuitive but matters. In a completely sealed tent in freezing weather, condensation from your breath and body heat can build up until the inside of the tent is wet, which drops the temperature faster than the cold outside would. So you need some airflow. But he needed to slow down how much cold came in with that air. He took a mylar emergency blanket, the kind they give out at marathons and disaster relief events, the thin silvery material that costs less than $2 at most camping stores, and hung it across the tent opening loose enough to move if the air needed to push through, but covering enough of the gap to block the direct flow of cold air. Mylar reflects radiant heat back toward its source, so his body heat, instead of radiating out through the opening, bounced back in. He got 2 of those blankets for $1 each from a dollar store near camp. He also started sleeping with a gallon jug of water that he'd heated during the day, using a small fire, or if fires were being cleared by enforcement that week, a small commercial hand warmer he'd been given. Warm water retains heat for a long time. A gallon jug that's at 90 degrees when you go to sleep is still noticeably warm 4 hours later. He put it under the blanket near his feet, which are where most people lose heat in a sleeping setup because the feet are farthest from the core. These weren't complicated modifications. They each cost almost nothing, but one closed a gap that had been making the initial setup less efficient than it could be. The final tally: 4 purchased bales at $28, 2 mylar blankets at $2, the 2 road bales free, $30. If you tried to replicate this today in most southwestern U.S. cities, you'd find straw bales at farm supply stores for $6 to $9 each. The mylar blankets are at most dollar stores or on Amazon for under $2. The free bales are variable, but they're around. Farm supply deliveries, agricultural areas near the edges of cities, construction sites using straw for erosion control. Declan found his by paying attention to what got left behind. The structure he built held 58 degrees Fahrenheit on a night that reached 19 degrees. That's a 39-degree differential between outside and inside, maintained through the night without any heat source beyond his own body. If that number sounds impossible, go find a straw bale and put a thermometer inside it on a cold night. The reading in the middle of that bale will not match the reading outside. That's not a claim about Declan's setup specifically. That's a property of the material you can test for $7 at any farm supply store. He stayed at the encampment for another 7 months after that. He wasn't warm every night. There were nights when enforcement cleared the camp and he couldn't keep the bales set up, nights when rain soaked the straw and it needed to dry before it worked properly again. Wet straw is a different material than dry straw. It loses a lot of its insulating property because the air pockets fill with water. He learned to cover the setup with a tarp if rain was coming, which he found in a dumpster. Bungee cords to hold it down. Declan had about 8 of those from various sources, since bungee cords turn up everywhere if you're paying attention to what people throw away. There were also limitations he never fully solved. The front of the structure was always the weakest point. In strong wind, even with the mylar covering, cold air got in. He tried weighting the blanket at the bottom with a piece of rebar he found, which helped. It didn't eliminate it. He also had to think about rodents. Straw is an attractive nesting material. He checked the bales every few days for signs of animals moving in. During one stretch, in February, he found a mouse had burrowed into the back wall. He reconfigured that bale, sealed the gap, and didn't have another problem with it. But it's a real concern that the setup requires monitoring. Declan will tell you it wasn't perfect. He's specific about what it didn't solve. He says it was the difference between suffering through the night and sleeping. For him, at that point, that difference was everything. He got a job in May of that year. A small construction crew doing residential framing. He knew enough from the drywall work to be useful, and the foreman hired him after a conversation in a parking lot. He moved into a room in a shared house. 6 weeks later, he still has the mylar blankets, keeps them in his jacket pocket. He says he doesn't keep them because he expects to need them again. He keeps them because they're the $2 object that helped him more than almost anything else during those 2 years, and getting rid of them feels wrong in a way he can't fully explain. When he talks about the straw bale setup, he doesn't talk about it like a survival story. He talks about it like a construction problem he solved, which it was. He had a surface that wasn't insulated, a material that provided insulation, and a geometry problem of how to connect them. He worked it out. It worked. The knowledge he used came from a fragment of a conversation somewhere on a construction site, from watching Arlo's plywood shelter, from understanding what drywall actually does when you install it inside a wall, from one afternoon of thinking about dead air and hollow tubes. None of it was specialized. None of it required anything he didn't already know. He was just the first person to put those specific pieces together for his specific problem. There are people sleeping outside in Albuquerque right now, tonight, who don't know this is possible with $30 and 2 hours. Maybe you've seen someone camped outside in cold weather, a tent near a highway overpass, a setup under a bridge, a pile of sleeping bags at the entrance to a parking garage, and wondered what they do when it gets really cold. Not wondered out loud, not in a way that led anywhere, just wondered. This is one answer, not the only answer, not the answer for every situation, and this is one answer, specific, replicable, tested. Built by a 21-year-old from Belen, New Mexico, who figured it out because nobody told him. Declan's not in social services. He's not running a program. He went back to construction framing, which is what he's good at. But he's talked about this with people he knows who are still outside. He's helped 3 people at that encampment set up their own versions of the structure. He says the hardest part isn't the building. The straw is cheap and the setup is genuinely not complicated. The hardest part is that when you're that cold and that exhausted, thinking like a construction problem looks impossible. Your brain doesn't work the way it does when you're warm and rested. He says he got lucky, that he happened to think of it on a day when he was functional enough to act on it. He's thought about whether there's a version of this that gets passed on more systematically. Information about what materials insulate, what they cost, how to configure them. Not a program, just knowledge. The kind of thing that could travel through an encampment as a conversation between people, the way Arlo's comment about dead air traveled to him. That's where the idea came from, in the end. One person who knew something. One sentence that unlocked everything else. Air doesn't move inside. That's all it is.